Ask any engineer, and the cars they admire most are usually the simplest. It sounds ridiculous, but from a design and engineering standpoint, making a car as small as humanly possible, yet allowing it to carry a family and be sold for peanuts, is a seriously tricky job. So today on TwinCam, let's explore what is possibly the ultimate city car, the Fiat 500. Before we get into it though, this car is to be auctioned by Manor Park Classics, so if you'd like to bathe in the fabric of Italian society, then please do follow the link in the description. But as with the Duetto Spider of only a few weeks ago, I've already saddled myself with a misnomer. Because in spite of its iconic nature, this is not the first Fiat 500. And that draws us into the context of why this car exists in the form it does. To find the roots of where we're heading, we need to go back nearly a century to the old Kingdom of Italy, when a man who wasn't particularly fond of petrol stations, but didn't know it yet, wanted to build an Italian people's car. We're all familiar with his moustached friend's plans of a similar style, but the original Fiat 500 is what prompted the brief for the Volkswagen. In spite of the Italian state owning Alfa Romeo, the task was given to the independent Fiat, who'd been planning something of this style as far back as 1915. A vehicle that was just on the correct side of the fence when compared to cycle cars, but that would cost less than 5,000 lira. The reins of the project were given to a man only in his late 20s at the time, Dante Giacosa, and what he came up with was nicknamed Topolino, or Little Mouse. The Fiat 500 was launched in 1936, and though it was actually closer to 9,000 lira, Turin produced over 500,000 units in 19 years, and that's with a world war in between. The Topolino was microscopic even by the standards of the day, but it featured such genius packaging that, although only having 2 seats, you could just about squeeze 4 people into one. Under the skin was a front-mounted and rear-driving 570cc water-cooled 4-cylinder side valve engine, producing 13 brake horsepower and allowing for 52 miles per hour. But ignoring the spec sheet, the Topolino was an exceptionally modern car for the late 1930s, and its success proved again the viability of small cars. So with that context therefore, you'd expect the Nuova Cinquecento to follow in its predecessor's footsteps. After all, the Topolino's layout appears very sensible through whichever lens you choose, but that's without the context of what the Italian people wanted and what they needed. So with Dante Giacosa yet again at the wheel, the new range of Fiat would look elsewhere for inspiration. 1955 would see the Topolino 500 usurped by the new Fiat 600. Now don't go adjusting your sets just yet, we will get to the new 500 in just a moment, but there's more context than offer first. You see, a decade on from the end of the Second World War, the new Italian Republic and its fragile democracy had bred an economic miracle. With $1.5 billion from the Marshall Plan, the north of Italy especially had seen an industrial and cultural revolution. Fiat no longer seeing the need to just introduce motoring to the masses, but to address the needs of Italian families. The 600 therefore was that bit larger, able to genuinely carry 4 people and their luggage and reach the dizzying heights of 60 miles per hour thanks to its 633cc and 21 brake horsepower 4-cylinder engine. But as I've already mentioned, the 600's mechanical layout was unrecognisable compared to the Topolino's, and taken generally, that would be carried forward into the new 500 only 2 years later. We'll get into that shortly, but for now, this car was here to provide the absolute basics. To be the most affordable form of 4-wheel motoring available, adept at replacing people's Vespas with something more comfortable, more practical, and safer. In a few words, the ultimate in city car design. Our little friend was to amalgamate the advances made by the array of people's cars that had flooded the market in the past 20 years, all of which had made the Topolino redundant. The Volkswagen, the Citroën 2CV and the Morris Minor all sat in vaguely the same segment as each other, but had almost nothing in common mechanically, and analysing their respective designs gives us a window into the mind of Dante Giacosa. Starting with the people's car itself, and the Beetle was designed for efficiency, practicality and dependability. It didn't break any new ground even back in the Topolino's era, but it brought existing philosophies together, embracing the famous Tatra-style aerodynamic shape, the compact rear transaxle and air-cooled engine, and simple transverse torsion bars and swing axle suspension. On the other hand, the Deux Chevaux towed a line between simplicity to entice first-time motorists and sophistication, both in chasing the simplicity and comfort to deal with the dreadful state of French roads. As a result, the Citroën has a canvas roof, instantly removable body panels and an even simpler flat twin as opposed to the flat 4 engine of the Beetle. However, it also features front-wheel drive, inboard front brakes and the remarkable interlinked suspension with leading and trailing arms. Alec Izagonis's Morris, on the other hand, acts as the antithesis to these austerity-led people's cars, setting its sights on ability and modernity. At the front is a water-cooled 4-cylinder engine, just a few hundred cc's larger than the 600s, paired to the traditional rear-wheel drive with longitudinal torsion bars front and a leaf-sprung live axle rear. This may not have given the ride quality of the 2CV, but it exceeded that of the Beetle and gave greater control than either, especially with rack and pinion steering. But the key is that the Minor did away with the separate floor pan of the Continentals, embracing the safer, more practical and stronger monocoque body shell. What this means is that when Dante Giacosa came to creating the 600 and 500, he had a wealth of standards from which to pick and mix. And as you compare these with our little Nuova Cinquecento, you can see him embracing and rejecting them in turn. But the final result was a true 4-seater car with a little bit of luggage space as well, that was shorter than the old 2-seat Topolino. That's the power of packaging, and this is how he did it. The name of the game is minimalism. If it's not strictly necessary, then it's not here. So the first question is the body shell and that big hole in the roof. Just as the 2CV taught us, fabric is both lighter and cheaper than steel, so our little 500 has a fold-back roof. Holding it all together, the Morris Minor taught us that unitary construction allows for better packaging and greater rigidity, improving perceived quality, so our little 500 is a monocoque. And if we step away from the fundamentals for a moment, we can take some time to appreciate that body shell. And the strange thing is that in 2024, we tend to view these cars as style icons. And that's weird. Of course, it's understandable, what with them being endlessly adorable to behold, but Dante Giacosa, an engineer, remember, did not design this body shell so you'd melt in its presence. Instead, it was designed to use as little sheet metal as possible. As I said, minimalism. Never mind the fabric roof and the fact it's taller than it is wide, but notice how much it tapers towards the roof, more so than any other car I can think of. And that's because the top half of the car only needs to accommodate some glass and your head. The bottom half, on the other hand, has to take elbows, legs, seats and all the bits to make the thing move. So why, you ask, is it all bubbly and rounded? Well, they wanted to use the thinnest steel possible, not only for cost, but also weight. And if you take a generally flat piece of steel, it bends, wobbles and breaks. By forming these radiuses, especially on the clamshell bonnet, Fiat could use this ultra-thin steel without any risk of damage. The final score was a curb weight of only 470 kilograms for an early Nuova Cinquecento. For reference, that's around half the mass of the current petrol-powered 500. To be fair, however, you are penalised for the sheer lack of car. While you can fit your friends in the back, and friends they really must be, you won't be going very far as the boot is shallow thanks to the suspension and is otherwise filled with a spare wheel and a fuel tank. Then again, you just buy a bigger car if you really needed it. That or a 500 Giardiniera. Back to the point though, and our next port of call is the power unit. But if we look back to the Topolino and forwards to 2024, another water-cooled 4-cylinder would have made perfect sense. That is, until we remember the word minimalism. And also remember that operating on this level, water-cooled engines are expensive. Not only do you need a big old radiator, but you also need pipework, a pump and a thermostat. All things an air-cooled engine doesn't need. Our friends the Beetle and 2CV both used air-cooled engines, so for their smallest car, Fiat developed an all-new air-cooled 2-cylinder. But unlike my examples, Giacosa rejected the boxer layout of the others, placing the 500 cylinders in line, where the cost could be lowered even further and the width minimised. Now, from the shots you'll be seeing, I'd be surprised if you hadn't noticed that the engine's in the rear. Again, this appears to be a retrograde step from the Topolino, but taken in context, it's entirely justified. If we imagine for a moment the traditional front engine rear drive layout, we see that it's horrendously inefficient. Scooping space from the passengers is a prop shaft. Then at the back we need a separate differential, and these two are expensive to boot. Much more sensible is a front engine front drive layout, seen transversely in this Austin Mini. Sure, it's very practical, but contrary to Fiat's wishes, it's also rather expensive. Not only do you need to package a gearbox either to the side or beneath, but to smoothly and efficiently transfer the power to the road, you're likely to end up using expensive and unreliable CV joints. After all, you're asking one axle to do both the steering and the driving, while the other just hangs about. The alternative, showcased by the Beetle, is to mount the engine at the back, behind the rear axle, where it doesn't take up much room and can provide its drive with as little drama as possible. And when utilised in a low-powered car like this, it means greater refinement and greater traction in slippery conditions, all the weight sitting over the driven axle. So sitting, thrumming away behind me, is a 499cc straight twin. Now that's unlike the flat twin of the 2CV or the flat 4, of course, of the Beetle. But it does mean that it's probably even more compact and a lot easier to maintain as well. This car, being a later one, produces 17 brake horsepower, but when the car weighs so little, it just doesn't matter. 17 brake horsepower never felt so quick, and of course we have the gear ratios to go alongside it, so I'm happily sitting doing 30, 35, 40 miles per hour here. There's nothing wrong with poodling this car around whatsoever. What I will say, however, is that with the engine being at the back, the gear change isn't all that well sorted, let's be honest. But the engine loves to work. It just loves to rev away behind you. It's only a little overhead valve thing, and clearly it isn't revving all that high, but it just loves to be worked. It absolutely loves it. Now, I've seen enough people who own 126s, this car's replacement if you didn't know, which used essentially the same mechanical layout, if with a slightly bigger engine. And they all say the same thing. They say that the engine, despite having no power, is just a gem. Yes, it's noisy, yes, it's unrefined, but it's characterful. It just loves to be worked and sit flat out all day, every day. And that's character. That is what gives a car character. In the mid-1950s, I don't think it would be unfair to say that vehicle suspension was basic. And in this instance, I don't mean basic in the positive way I've been thus far referring to the 500, but it was an era of swing axles and leaf springs. Technologies which, when used incorrectly, lead to reputations. Part of the reason why rear-engine cars have a generally bad name is because of the venerable swing axle, a medium used by the Beetle in period and later the infamous Chevrolet Corvair. Yet anyone into cars knows the brilliant capabilities of the likes of the modern Porsche 911s and, in less exotic circumstances, the little Hillman Imp. So the way Dante Giacosa went about harnessing the 500's mighty two-cylinder grunt was to use semi-trailing arms. These triangular-shaped arms sit below the rear end and ensure that the wheel's camber angles don't fly too far out of spec. And to complement them, Giacosa didn't spec leaf springs or torsion bars, but full coil springs. This was not the cheapest or the most space-efficient system available, but it was necessary to make the 500 handle like a good engineer would want it to. And the same thinking draws through to the front, where cars at the time were generally using lever arm dampers to keep costs low, but Fiat used telescopic dampers on the 500 as they require less maintenance and allow for better geometry. For the geometry in question is a spindly, if still technically, a double wishbone system. This remains today the pinnacle of passenger car suspension, used by Honda in their Pomp, Austin Morris in the Mini, and looking back to earlier, Porsche in only the current 911 GT3. The springing medium, however, is a little more curious, because rather than use longitudinal torsion bars like the Morris Minor, Giacosa yet again compromised the packaging by choosing an arguably superior, but definitely cheaper, single transverse leaf spring. This is part of why the boot is so shallow, but a leaf spring isn't something we'd usually consider to be superior to anything. But the 500 presents a unique case, where all the weight is at the back, potentially leaving the front light and skittish as a result. The leaf spring connects each side of the car, ensuring that when one side is compressed, the other isn't flung up into the air. The stabilising effect of a transverse leaf is even used today in Volvo's rear suspension, yet here's the principle in practice some 67 years ago. So what the 500 brought us in terms of suspension is actually unlike the cars we've just referenced. At the front is, well, it's strange actually, because usually you'd find an independent front end and a non-independent rear end on a small car of this kind of era, but this is the wrong way round. This car has an independent rear suspension and a non-independent front end, because at the front is a single transverse leaf spring. So I suppose it's taking something from the Morris Minor, and it has telescopic shock absorbers as well. But what that means is that the 500 kind of belies the fact that it's got that engine at the back, and it keeps the front end really well tied down to the road. And you wouldn't be able to tell that it's missing all the weight here, because the steering has a lovely, lovely weighting to it. And yes, you can't chuck it around like you can a Mini, for example, but that's not the point. This wasn't designed to be a driving machine. It was designed to be a car of the people, which a lot of people seem to forget when they compare 500 and Mini. The point of these cars was not to be like the Mini. The point of these cars was to be accessible, and this was so much more accessible and so much more dependable as well than a Mini ended up being. That engine's great, but at the back it learns its lessons from the Beetle, which was also rear-engined of course, because the Beetle had swing axles, which are not very good if I'm quite honest. What it means is that they are really susceptible to camber changes, and it can lead to the wheels tucking under. The 500 uses semi-trailing arms and coil springs, which is not quite the most practical system to use. So, from what I've said, it's actually not the right thing to be doing, but what it does give the 500 is much more composure than you'd expect from many other rear-engine little economy cars. And it gives it so much more composure and neutrality by having all the sophistication at the back to deal with the weight of that engine. It is surprising, but it goes to show the genius of Dante Giacosa, where he wasn't absolutely hell-bent on achieving his goals of the ultimate in economy, because he realised something had to be done. And he did that something in giving it that quite sophisticated rear suspension. For those of you who aren't quite so up on different suspension layouts, semi-trailing arm rear suspension is the same suspension that BMW used up until the early 1990s. It is not some economy-driven system. So driving the 500 in general, it's a bit strange because the brake and clutch pedal are right close to each other. I can't quite get the hang of heel and toeing, but I imagine it's very easy once you do actually grow some confidence in the car. But they're so close to each other and they're really high, which means you have to kind of raise your leg and step down on the clutch pedal. But it's perfectly comfortable. I have no elbow room whatsoever. But it is perfectly comfortable sitting here on these reclining seats because, of course, it's a 500 Lusso we're driving. It's just a thoroughly charming little car. You know, I got into this car this morning and I expected it to be fun. And that's what it is. It is fun. But I didn't expect it to feel so competent. I expected it to feel slow. Now, I've driven slow cars. I've dailied slow cars. But I expected this with less than 20 horsepower to be really slow. But it's not. The gear ratios make up for it. And of course, the total lack of any weight. And the car is so light and so nimble, and it has that weird mix of non-independent front but independent rear suspension, which is wacky, but it's ever so rewarding. So from all I've said and what we collectively know about this car, you're probably expecting me to say that they flew off the forecourts, but I'm afraid that's not the case. Because back in 1957, it appeared as though the Italian public were rejecting the Nuova Cinquecento. Remember that the Fiat 600 was only launched 2 years prior, and on the surface, the two appeared pretty similar. At this point, the wait time on a Seicento was over a year, so it's not as if the 500 was here to create new demand. And in the form Fiat originally offered it, I don't think anyone was going to take it seriously. When I say these little cars were minimalist, I really mean it. Not only did the early cars have 13 brake horsepower, but they didn't have a fuel gauge even. But the real kicker is the fact that the very first 500s didn't have any rear seats. Sure, you could just pile people in as you did with the old Topolino, but the majority were happy to just fork out more money and have the larger, faster, 4-seat 600. In 1960, therefore, Fiat brought along a facelift known as the 500D, adding more chrome, more steelwork, a little more luxury, and the larger, widow-making 17 brake horsepower engine we've experienced today. As a result, sales of the 500 went from a dreadful 9,000 per year in 1958 to over 100,000 in 1962. With the later 500 Lusso we've driven today, luxuries including bumper overriders and a fuel gauge even, 1969, 12 years into production, was when the 500 peaked. Overall, they built nearly 3.9 million. And given the fact the modern 500s are the only Fiats people actually want to buy, I wouldn't count on this basic shape disappearing anytime soon. Looking back, it's amazing it took Fiat so long to reboot the 500, but I suppose that gap was actually a good sign. See, the 500 cemented Fiat's reputation for building truly great small cars. After its sales figures eventually snowballed, it was replaced by the nearly identical 126, which sold in even greater numbers. That was then replaced by the original Fiat Panda, examples of which 20 years after the end of production still litter the Italian countryside. The segment up then saw the likes of the Uno and Punto, which were sold all over the world in ridiculously huge numbers that any other manufacturer would kill for. It was only as that era drew to a close that Fiat felt the need to reboot the 500. So here we sit at the end of the 1960s in a car that hadn't really kept up with the competition all that well. Fiats were at the beginning of yet another Dante Giacosa driven bout of genius as they moved towards front-wheel drive. And what that means is that this car is an outlier. It's a palate cleanser compared to the ever-quickening and ever-modernising world. And as far as I can tell, that's what classic cars should be. So with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description, and I'll have more videos coming along soon.